Hey guys, we're talking about the argument from recollection, which is starts on page 21 of Phaedo at 73c. Now, this argument argues like the argument from cyclical process and the argument from affinity of souls for the immortality of the soul, of course. That's what Socrates is doing. So this is probably the most interesting, to me at least, the most interesting argument that he presents in this book for the immortality of the soul. It deals with the idea that everything that we learn is actually just remembered, meaning we sort of knew it before. And we knew it before in that period of that cyclical process, that sort of cycle of life and death. We knew everything. We had all perfect knowledge when our souls departed from our bodies, meaning after death and before rebirth, before the soul met with another body. There's that period, that interim there between bodies, in which the soul is by itself, not shackled with the body, not beholden to the desires and the confusions of the sensory perceptions and the appetites of the body, in which the soul's free to sort of take in pure, perfect knowledge. And so his argument for this, though, which is quite interesting, is on the bottom of page 21 at 73c. Socrates says, I'll put it this way. We agree, I take it, that if anyone is to be reminded of a thing, he must have known that thing at some time previously, which is sort of a premise for the argument, which is pretty obvious. That's the definition of recollection. If you are reminded of something, you must have known that thing previously. There's not much sense in denying that. But then when he gets into examples, the argument from recollection has some interesting examples in it that are supposed to prove this point, and they're pretty good arguments. And I sort of tend to present this argument with some visual aids, okay? Examples that you have in your life, maybe even on a daily basis. For instance, he talks about these ideas that we associate with our sensory perceptions, but really he's trying to prove that we can only have certain ideas that we interpret our sensory perceptions through or with if those ideas existed before we had sensory perceptions, meaning we had this prior innate knowledge, knowledge that we are born with, rational conceptual knowledge about perfect shapes, mathematical things, perfect geometrical forms. For instance, he says equality. Now, we don't mean equality like equality between people or a social or political type of equality. He means actual identicalness between different objects, something that is absolutely equal to something else. He says at the bottom of page 22 at 74a, he says, we say, don't we, that there is something that is equal. I don't mean a log to a log or a stone to a stone or anything else of that sort, but something further beyond all those, equality itself or the equal itself. So he wants to contrast the many things that we observe through the senses that are sort of equal, more or less equal, but not completely equal to each other, and contrast that with the actual concept or idea of equal or equality. And he's trying to prove that the concept of equality or equalness, we must have that in our mind first. We must have that rational concept in order to understand any sensory perceptions of things that are of greater or lesser equality. What's an example of this? He says, where did we get knowledge of comparing a log to a log or a stone to a stone, or some of these things that come through our senses that are sort of equal but never perfectly equal? How do we know that they're not perfectly equal? And this is his whole argument. How do we know that the things that come through our sensory perceptions aren't actually perfect? What are we using to what point of reference are we using to judge? What standard are we using to judge these things against, to know that they're greater or lesser levels of equality or perfection? So, for instance, take these two pens. He says a log to a log or a stone to a stone because we're talking about a long time ago, But in these days we have manufactured products. These two pens are somewhat equivalent, but they're not exactly the same. They're not perfectly equal, right? They're just similar. We know that these are, to some extent, equal, but not really equal. And then this pen to this pen, right, are of lesser equality than this pen to this pen. And if you take two other things that are, for example, I'm just using random objects around the house, but these two remote controls they're not completely equal, but they're close to being equal, even though there's some obvious dissimilarities. Now, Socrates asked us, have we ever seen two things that are absolutely identical through our senses? And most people's answers, again, would be no. You take even two pens, two things that are manufactured to be identical, and there's always a little flaw, a little tiny difference between them when we look very closely, okay? Even things that are manufactured to be exactly the same, there's always a tiny little difference, always a little flaw here and there. And his point is, how can we know this if we've never actually witnessed through our senses something that is 100% completely equal? And his point is, we have to have an idea of absolute perfect equality or perfect identicalness before we judge our sensory perceptions to be more or less greater or lesser levels of equality. Meaning, in order to know that these two pens are not completely equal, but they're more equal or more equivalent to each other than these two pens, we must have, before we make those judgments, in order to make those judgments, we must have as our point of reference or as our standard perfect equality. And since perfect equality has never come through the senses, we've never seen two things which are 100% identical, then it must be a rational concept that we have before we have perceptions, meaning before we had a body and the perceptions, we must have had perfect knowledge. Now, that may not be the most convincing argument that he uses in the book, but think of some other arguments that you could use along similar lines. He talks about angles and circles and things like this, meaning think about the angle of like this screen, this angle here, or the angle of a window or something. Again, geometers and people who measure these things out would say, well, we don't really have perfect right angles in the sensory world. Okay, we can't really create an absolutely perfect right angle. It's not out there. Even on the computer, if you really measure it out, there's a slight flaw there. But how can we know this? How do we know that they're not perfect right angles? If we've never seen one through the senses, we have to be getting our reference point from somewhere with which to judge that our sensory perceptions are not perfect. Like the angle of that painting right there, that poster. It's not a perfect right angle. I'm sure if you measured it out, you go, with some geometrical instruments, it's not really perfect. It's close. But how do you know it's close? How do you know that angle, that right angle, is closer than, this to being a right angle? How do you know that? Because you have this perfect geometrical idea in your mind. Now, again, these examples, you may say, well, the one I really like, and the one Shelley Kagan brings up in the paper we're going to read this week, is perfect circles. I really like that one. Okay, is this a perfect circle, this compact disc? Or your watch or a clock or whatever. Is it perfect? Well, we measure it out. Anything we think is a perfect circle, and we always find it's very close, but it's not quite perfect. Yet we know that this is a more perfect circle than, let's say, this or something, or my head, or whatever you want to use, Now, you could say, yeah, because we know what a perfect circle is, because we have things that are really close to perfect circles. How do we know that they're close to perfect circles? How do we know that this is close to a perfect circle, that it's very, very close, and this is not, and this shape, or whatever, I could draw things on the screen. How do we know the difference between something that's like an oval and something that's almost a perfect circle, which I could find around here if I looked hard enough, but there's nothing in the immediate surroundings, and then this, which is very close. In order to make these judgments on a scale or on a gradient or a spectrum of this is close to a perfect circle but not quite there. If you measure this out, you'd say, oh, there's a little flaw there, it's not quite perfect. What standard are we using to judge that these are imperfect to different degrees or closer to perfection when it comes to circularity? If we agree we've never actually created or witnessed a perfect circle through the senses. The point Socrates is making is it's not through our sensory perceptions that these ideas or these standards or what he calls forms of perfect geometrical shapes come from. They don't come from our sensory perceptions because we agree we have never witnessed one or been able to create one. Therefore, the source of our knowledge of the standards or the points of reference we use, or these forms of perfect shapes that we use to judge the imperfections, the level of imperfection of our sensory perceptions, has to come from somewhere else. It can't come from our senses because we don't have these things through our senses. So it must come, and we're able to make the judgments on the greater or lesser perfect circularity, right angleness, equality, whatever. We're able to make those interpretations and those judgments of the imperfections we have. We have to have that standard or that form of perfection when it comes to shapes in our mind before we make those judgments, obviously. Or we wouldn't be able to say this is close to a perfect circle. Therefore, it must come before we have sensory perceptions, and therefore before we have a body. We must have perfect knowledge of these forms and shapes before we have senses in order to make the judgments that we do on the shapes that we have and that we create in the world as greater or lesser degrees of perfectness. What is a perfect circle? Well, it's a measurement, equidistant radii to a central point, right? But did we make that up? Then that becomes very interesting. How can you make that up? How can you say, oh, that's a perfect circle? I got it in my mind, if you've never experienced it through the senses. I mean, you'd have to learn it from some other source other than the senses. It has to be purely rational. So that's really his argument for rationalism. There's different ways to interpret this and talk about it too, that we will during a Zoom session. And I want to get your feedback on it. But it's really an intriguing question because many people, empiricists, try to say, that's ridiculous. You just take a bunch of things that you experience and you put them together and you come up with a perfect idea. Many would argue that's impossible, though, that you can't get a perfect concept or idea of something from an imperfect one. Plato talks about, Socrates talks about perfect beauty. Everything we experience through the senses is beautiful to some extent, greater or lesser, but how can we see that beauty is always flawed through the senses? There's no perfect beauty. That means we have to have a concept of perfect beauty, and with everything else as well. But the best examples are mathematic and geometrical, because most of us can find a much more clear point regarding the forms of math and geometry. We'll talk about this more for